Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and at long last, 3 years after I began reading The Eye of the World, the series is done. I've now had plenty of occasion to say this in like half a dozen or more videos at this point, but I don't really care. I am proud of this accomplishment, having finished A Memory of Light at this point more like a month ago, but relatively recently, and the series is no small part of this channel's DNA by now. I've only been doing booktube, like 4.5 years at this point, and Wheel of Time has occupied a full 3 years of that, so like 2/3 of my channel's lifespan has been spent in some way, shape, or form in the middle of this series. But this video isn't actually about the full series. This video is about A Memory of Light. Episodes 311 and 314 of the Book Binge will be about the series. So today we're going to review A Memory of Light, predominantly by Brandon Sanderson, the final book of the Wheel of Time. So let's start off just as normal with the good of the book. And honestly, I'm going to try my best here, but there is so much good to talk about with this final novel of the series. I don't even know where to begin. For reference, I would say the average amount of words that I have in any of my reviews video notes is somewhere in the ballpark of 500 words or so, 500 to 600 words maybe. I have like nearly 600 words just in the notes for the good of A Memory of Light. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about here. The other aspect is that I actually wrote my notes for the good of A Memory of Light after I had already done my notes for the bad, the ugly, and the recommendations. So actually coming back around and trying to quantify or qualify, I guess, whatever you want to consider it, the actual measure of what I think works about this book was a pretty difficult one, all things considered. But what it really comes down to for me is that I have to give massive props to Sanderson for managing to pull off what he did here, because A Memory of Light is an incredible close to 3 different things. It is a close to its own arc, its own existence as an individual book. It works on its own accord, but it also works as the close to the final arc of the series, this last trilogy, so to speak, the last 3 books, and it works as a close to the entire 14-book series at large. So in some sense, it had 3 different things that it needed to satisfy. Granted, those things are all very much interconnected and related, but there are books that are good books by themselves without being good ends to a series, for example. That is something that is possible to happen, but A Memory of Light does not manage to disappoint in those regards. The first thing worthy of note about A Memory of Light for me is its prologue. However, this is something that I want to shout out from this book specifically, is because I think it is arguably the best prologue of the series, and I think it is the only prologue of the series to justify being, over 2 hours long or something? Let me go ahead and check my notes here, see how long I actually took to read the prologue of Memory of Light, just because I don't remember off the top of my head. And it was about 2 hours and 20 minutes. Every other instance of one of the prologues of any of these books being over like an hour, maybe an hour and a half tops, I felt like was genuinely unjustified. There are a couple of prologues, notably Crossroads of Twilight and Knife of Dreams, both have like 4-hour long prologues where you don't need a prologue that long. You just don't. Most of that material did not need to be in the prologue. Prologues should be prologues because the material is in some way, shape, or form ancillary to the primary plotting of the book, or otherwise relevant to the main story from external perspectives that aren't like your primary perspectives. So A Memory of Light manages to be like the one prologue that manages to get to be 2 hours or longer that I feel like fully justifies itself. So that's something that I wanted to note right off the bat. But after the prologue happens and we move into the main body of the book, what really impresses me about A Memory of Light is that there are just so many moving pieces that it's actually like, to say it's impressive is almost an understatement, because it's hard to keep track of it all. It's hard to keep track of it all as a reader who read the book in only 9 days. which, mind you, is really quick for me, but we'll talk about that point a little bit later. But when there's this much going on, the fact that Sanderson was able to actually keep track of everything and all of it really work and make sense is no small thing. And furthermore, not just being able to keep track of everything, but also being able to write so much disparate material and keep track of it is a huge thing. Now, I'm relatively confident in the assumption, basically, that probably a lot of these plot lines, if you want to call them plot lines, within the book were written more or less like in groups, in bunches, where a bunch of scenes from individual POVs were written all at once, and then, with probably intentional spaces of where those scenes would be able to be broken, to be split throughout the book, because there's a lot of scene hopping, and again, that's another topic that we'll probably talk about a little bit later in this video, but even in the context of writing several scenes for any given POV, then several scenes from the next and several scenes from the next, as I assume probably was the way that a lot of this material was written, being able to write all of that stuff and then be able to cut it back and forth is honestly just as impressive as being able to plan what scenes are actually going to happen in what order from the beginning and then writing them in that order. No matter which way the book was written, no matter how that was gone about, it is impressively executed here. As an additional point to this topic as well is the fact that something like this would be incredibly impressive to pull off, even if all of the material that Sanderson wrote was his own, if this was entirely his own series. But the fact that he came in for the very end of the series and was able to execute upon the ending so well is itself also another thing that is incredibly impressive. And beyond just how much he was able to keep track of, I also think that it is important to note just how much focus there is in A Memory of Light. Focus that I would argue that even Towers of Midnight didn't really have. Focus that The Gathering Storm definitely had, but A Memory of Light, despite so much going on, has a sharp focus to it that I honestly just have to admit I think that Robert Jordan would have lacked. Just the way that he wrote stories and the way that he wrote many different storylines, the way that he wrote throughout the entirety of the series, namely with multiple chapters coming from the same POVs and not really doing a bunch of scene hopping. I struggle to see how Robert Jordan could have written an ending with as much going on as this in the same kind of way, in the effective way that this managed to be effective. Not necessarily as a dig at Robert Jordan per se, but more so just the fact that this particular handling of POV switching and stuff was done very well, and I don't think that that's how Robert Jordan would have gone about it, but I'm glad that this is how it was gone about for this book ultimately. The way that the fronts of the battle split and converge multiple times throughout the book is also worthy of noting, because there's not just a whole lot going on between a bunch of different places, there's a whole lot going on between different places as several different groups of them come together and split apart and stuff throughout the book. That's another thing. The plotting is just so tight that it's really, really engaging to follow. And that's another point as well. The plotting is so tight that you can often predict the end goal of what's going on. You know what characters are trying to do, and even in cases where you're not 100% sure what they're trying to do, you're able to figure that out because the plotting and the organization of it is so well constructed that it's just kind of implicit and inherent to the reader if they're paying very much attention at all. And that is a very rewarding reading experience. And it also manages to not be a bad thing retroactively, or in spite of itself, I guess would probably be the better way to phrase it. It manages to not be bad in spite of itself, because things don't actually often work as expected. There are hiccups. There are things that crop up that are unexpected. So you see an end goal and you're going there and you're just okay, I see what's going on here. How are things going to go wrong for this particular group at this time? And the way that things go wrong between different fronts of the battle and for different people changes. Like there are some through lines that are similar between all of it, as like the enemy front can be considered, but like there's just so much between all of it that feels fresh between the different groups of it. Like despite this being 350,000 words and basically the entirety of that being the last battle, not just the chapter, but like this entire book is just the last battle. The fact that you're able to have such a massive sequence and none of it felt redundant, none of it felt repetitive, none of it felt like it was already doing what other scenes had previously done, like that is impressive. But speaking of like doing things that scenes need to do, let's move on to another category of good that A Memory of Light manages to achieve, like just so intrinsically well. All of the major storylines have really satisfying resolutions in the grand scheme of things. This even goes into some of the more side stuff, but especially the main stories are really well handled. Egwene, for example, gets to fill an incredible role all the way to the end of the series, and a lot of her material throughout the series was some of my personal favorite, which isn't necessarily the most popular opinion. I know there are people who absolutely hate all of the Egwene stuff. I love it, but she gets a really great material in this book. Perrin gets to move beyond his personal character arc that finally got to have some movement already in the previous book, and it gets to be relevantly important within this book in a lot of ways, and he gets to do things that literally no other character can actually do, and having a specific role for himself is rewarding after there were a lot of books where he just felt genuinely useless within the series, and quite frankly was objectively useless and was not doing anything worth reading about in the series. Robert Jordan just completely bungled everything about Perrin post book 4, and Brandon Sanderson was able to utilize him quite well in Towers of Midnight, but especially was able to bring him in more fully in A Memory of Light in ways that I think are really great. There are slight disappointments in accordance with that, some things that I would have liked to see, which, something that we'll probably talk about either later in this video or in like the next one. But there's a lot of good going on with Perrin. Matt also gets to play a part that feels really authentic to what we know from his character, from even going all the way back to like Fires of Heaven. He had some moments in Fires of Heaven that were really great, that like are reflected deeply and quite well in A Memory of Light. I think that is great, and it also leads towards an interesting future that's coming up for him, that his entire story arc actually feels like it was leading somewhere the entire time, and even at the end of this book it feels like it's leading there for post-series stuff that obviously we aren't going to get to see at this point, but like you can imagine a lot of that, which is really great. Similarly, on the imagination front, like Elaine, it doesn't have like the tightest resolution the way that some of the other characters do, but the way that her condition is left off in this book is really satisfying, namely in accordance with like the Aiel and some other things like that, some experiences in accordance with her and Rand and some other characters that are associated with Rand are really closed off in a way for this book that again leaves things open for the future of the series that are like really interesting to think about, things that don't need to be explicitly explained, things that work in that way and for that reason. They work for the ways of you can imagine for yourself what happens next, and I think that is worth having in a series this large. Some things that are building towards a future, even if you never get to see that on page, because if every single little thing was wrapped up so perfectly that you can't really picture what comes next after a 14-book series, might suggest that the world and everything was a lot smaller than it kind of projects itself being. But basically you get to fill in the gaps at times when it is appropriate to be able to fill in gaps. And I think A Memory of Light does a good job knowing which gaps are appropriate to be left for readers to fill rather than trying to do it itself. So that's great. Some of the other storylines, Rand in particular, the main character of the series, he gets to have a really amazing metaphysical showdown within this book that just works incredibly well within the context of everything else going around outside, both from a timeline perspective and from a content perspective, and also from a thematic perspective, and we'll touch on that in just a moment. Even some of the antagonists, like the Forsaken in particular, they all have varying ends to their stories in one form or another that feel very true to their characters throughout the series, regardless of how you feel about the Forsaken throughout the series, because some people find them to be somewhat more cartoonish or somewhat unbelievable in some respect throughout different parts of the series. And for some of them, I definitely agree. But for all of the characters that are left, all the major players of the series that are left in A Memory of Light, basically all of them have something that closes off their arc at the end of the book that feels genuine to their character specifically. That's no small thing to pull off. But we did mention thematic related stuff just a moment ago, and I think that speaking of Rand and also the Forsaken, Brandon actually brings thematic stuff to the forefront here. It is something that I've mentioned in a couple other videos and will be mentioning in the next couple videos most likely, is that, there's not a whole lot of real thematic depth to the series, all things considered. I think that for a series as big as this is, I think it's a little bit underwhelming, the kind of thematic exploration that it has and what ideas it tries to explore. It does so in such an offhand way that it doesn't feel particularly engaging. That's something that Robert Jordan, I just don't think, was very good at. That's a personal opinion of mine. But Brandon Sanderson was able to read into what those things were and reincorporate them into the plot of the last act of the series in ways that are really good. Rand's character is definitely the standout here. The Gathering Storm starts to evoke what it feels like Robert Jordan was trying to do, but left too vague for it to really actually mean that much as far as, the themes of the Chosen One and stuff like that are concerned. Towers of Midnight continued to work on a lot of that. It works in conversation with the Gathering Storm, especially with regard to Rand. And then A Memory of Light finally takes all of what those last couple of books were doing, and, basically sees what Robert Jordan was likely intending to be the point of the series, and Sanderson makes that the point of this book. There's also aspects of the execution of that thematic material and the way that's executed in the metaphysical fight that feels like it was kind of trying to remind of the climax of Winter's Heart in some ways, interestingly enough, but where I think that Winter's Heart failed to actually evoke anything. A Memory of Light managed to make that a very real on the page thing that was actually really effective. So that's just another random point to bring up. But even as far as the actual action itself goes, not just, where characters end up or major storylines, not just talking about the themes or anything like that. As far as the actual action goes, the action itself of A Memory of Light, I think this book does it a lot better than anything else in Wheel of Time. There's not a single other sequence of the Wheel of Time where action is concerned that I think even holds a candle to A Memory of Light. I really like the climax of The Dragon Reborn and Fires of Heaven, and I really love Dumai's Wells. I really love the climax of The Gathering Storm, but none of them can come even close to the scale of what A Memory of Light is. This entire book is a climax, so that in and of itself is, kind of hard to top in that regard. But there's not a single other climax or fight in the series that works as well as this book manages to work as an entire piece, as an entire body. The entire book being that sequence definitely worked for me. I'm definitely a climax and resolution person. My favorite parts of basically everything I experience with reading are almost always, or rather the things that define my reading experiences are the climax and resolution for sure. I can very easily forgive books I otherwise just don't really like if I think the climax and resolution are good enough. And there are books that I genuinely really love that have been just completely ruined because I don't think that the climax is very good. That's not necessarily unique to me per se, but it is definitely how I'm geared towards an experience. I'm not somebody who like weighs the beginning of a book more than the end, generally speaking. And so A Memory of Light being like the end in 3 different senses, both for its own arc, for the arc of the last battle, and for the arc of the entire series, just, it's really, really effective. And the action throughout is really good. You know, just, I have a hard time believing that Robert Jordan would have been able to write what this was as compelling for me. You know, I talked about how like the POV jumping and allocation, stuff like that, was really good in this book, and I just don't know how Robert Jordan would have been able to handle a book like this because of the way that he wrote stuff. You know, whenever he did do a lot of POV hopping in climactic sequences like Winter's Heart and Path of Daggers, I think that those are easily some of his weakest moments of writing, where those individual scenes just overall don't actually mean anything. And so I don't know if that would be indicative of how well he could have written a version of A Memory of Light. I don't know. I really don't know. But as far as this is concerned, all I know is that Brandon Sanderson did it very well, and I'm a little bit dubious as to how Robert Jordan could have done it. And speaking of that comparison between Brandon and Robert Jordan, relatedly, I just have to say that Brandon Sanderson's prose is also much smoother. So like the actual reading experience, the active reading experience for A Memory of Light is a lot more for me. This is a very, very thick book, but I managed to get through it incredibly quickly. You know, as a general point to close this section, this took me only 9 days to read, and I read the last 290 pages in a day. Granted, that day was literally like 10 plus hours of that day, just me reading those last 290 pages. So I still read slow, but as I discussed in another video relatively recently, I think it was probably the last Wheel of Time diary, I think, so last Thursday's video, I believe, where I talk about the final trilogy, you know, as a whole, I kind of discuss a little bit of this point between Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson as authors. You know, I think that Robert Jordan's execution of non-action throughout the series definitely leans more towards proclivities of bloat. And that's not to say that all of his non-stuff is bloat. Like there's plenty of his writing that I think is fine. I think his first 5 books don't suffer from bloat to any like particularly notable fashion, whereas 6 through 11 I think really do. So, you know, there's some give and take there, but I think that generally speaking, his non-action is quite wordy, even at the times that I didn't hate it. And quite frankly, I didn't hate Robert Jordan's prose even when it was really wordy. It got to be frustrating sometimes, but I didn't dislike it at all. And on the more action side of things, I think that Robert Jordan's handling of action leaned towards like flash in the pan type of moments where something happens and then all of a sudden it's done, and like you're not really sure what actually just happened without rereading it, because you're used to this man's writing being so methodical is not the right term. We'll just say slow, generally speaking. You're so used to it being so slow that when something suddenly happens, when you have a 15-page chapter that effectively doesn't actually do anything, even if I still like that chapter, when suddenly you have like the last 10 pages of The Shadow Rising that are like the entire climax and resolution within like 10 pages, it's like I have to read those 10 pages again because what actually just happened, everything just happened so quickly. Robert Jordan's balance between the moments of non-action versus the moments of action, it was off. It was something that bothered me a lot. You know, his most effective action moments are the times when he's spending a lot of time actively building up towards stuff, like where the Dragon Reborn, that entire book is leading up until that climax, and so that climax is a little bit more effective than, say, Eye of the World, where that climax is very sudden, because like you're not actually sure what's going to happen at the end of that. Dragon Reborn, you pretty much know what's going to happen at the end of that, so like it's not so sudden. Fires of Heaven. That entire book is also building up towards the climax in multiple different regards and all of the different POVs, and it works in a way similar to Dragon Reborn. Dumai's Wells is like the one exception to where Robert Jordan just will suddenly decide that the climax is happening now, and it doesn't feel like it was rushed or mishandled or something like that. So that's like my broad scope opinion of how Robert Jordan's prose kind of works with the series. He was either doing too much with it, like I said, leaning towards bloat, or not doing enough, leaning towards just things suddenly happening and you don't even know what happened because it happened 15 trillion times faster than he normally allows anything else to happen, depending on the circumstance. In comparison, I think that Sanderson keeps a much better balance throughout his entries of the series, and that is especially true with A Memory of Light. This is like the exact point that I mentioned in that last Wheel of Time diary, is like I did some rough calculations basically while I was recording the video of how fast I read Robert Jordan's prose during a couple different points in the series, both in the first trilogy and in like the last book that he wrote, for example, compared to this book as a counterpoint example. I think I might have compared one of the others of Sanderson's books. I don't remember off the top of my head, but in either case, what it comes down to is that I read Sanderson's prose in this book like 20 to 30 words per minute faster than I read any of Robert Jordan's prose in any of his entries, just as a rough, estimation. And 20 to 30 words for somebody who reads less than 200 words a minute, my average is like around 175 words a minute. Robert Jordan was closer to 155 to 165, whereas Brandon Sanderson was closer to 185 for me. And that difference is huge. That swing makes a big difference. It meant that I got through this 350,000 word book quicker than, plenty of other examples. This book took me 31 and a half hours to read. Let's see what a comparable length of a reading experience was for a different Robert Jordan entry. Like just find something like we'll say A Crown of Swords is relatively comparable, but what's even funnier about it is, what did I say Memory of Light took me? 31.5 hours for over 350,000 words. A Crown of Swords is 60,000 words shorter and took me an hour and a half longer to read. That in and of itself kind of tells you the difference between the reading speed. And I think that for the purposes of what this final arc needed to do, what honestly this entire series needed to do, and what Robert Jordan was actually pretty good at doing with the first few books, i.e. relative brevity, A Memory of Light, Sanderson in general just managed to make his entries read quick enough that it wasn't like having to fight myself to read. Like back in some of the later Robert Jordan entries, it was like I could read maybe 20 pages an hour if I tried. Like based off of how many words are on each page and my reading speed, it generally took me like 3 to 3.5 minutes per page, sometimes more if they were particularly slow, which was like the case for Knife of Dreams in the first half, for example. But Sanderson, in comparison, those pages took me less than 2.5 minutes per page consistently. There were portions of A Memory of Light that took me barely 2 minutes per page, and that was despite having not too dissimilar word per page count between his 3 books and like Knife of Dreams, I think, is probably the most relevant example. But yeah, like that just kind of puts into perspective. There is a degree to which the smoothness of your prose and how quickly it can be read can help or hinder your story. And for just general epic fantasy, if it is taking forever to read, that's not fantastic. And Sanderson managed to fix that for me personally. But we've talked about that point a little bit more than I think we needed to, and that closes all of my major points about the good. I think we might as well just kind of go into the bad of Memory of Light, because I think that there are some things that are going to, rub certain people the wrong way. These aren't necessarily all things that I think were bad. There's a degree to which some of them are definitely true, of course. Some of them are based on my experience, but not all of them are. The first one of note is actually not something that I personally struggled with, but as a general point, this entire book is a climax. It is a 900-page battle, basically. If you're not into huge battles, or if you're not into that style of climax, there's definitely a degree to which A Memory of Light won't be for you. You know, I have a friend who read through the entire series and really liked Brandon Sanderson's entries, you know, really liked the end of the series, how he managed to close it all. But, you know, A Memory of Light was definitely his least favorite of the Sanderson entries because he's just not into huge battle stuff, you know? And so that being what this entire book is, if you're not into that, then it's not going to sit super well for you. You know, this may be a pretty obvious or even silly to point out, but like I said, I know some people who had this kind of reaction to Memory of Light just because that's not what they're into, and that's fair enough. At the same time, however, if you expect the last book of a 14-book series to not be in itself in an entire climactic sequence, most likely of the battle sort, because that's just kind of how this genre works, then there's a degree to which that's on you, of course. But, you know, Reen still enjoyed then the last book here, but it was just his least favorite of the last three for that specific reason. So that's why I include that point in the bad here. The next one of these points is a little bit more specific to me. I definitely think that there's a particular piece of the battle here. There's a particular character and people that show up that I think isn't actively foreshadowed enough for my tastes. You know, there's a degree to which like the more passive foreshadowing is like there at different parts of the series, but it's definitely not something that was forefront enough that the reveal was able to be satisfying. Part of this was intentional. Robert Jordan literally intended to never depict some of the stuff that I wish would have been depicted for active foreshadowing reasons here, but part of it was incidental on Brandon Sanderson's part, where he actually decided that he tried to include some scenes that would have actively foreshadowed some of this stuff, but that material ended up having to be cut from the book. This is one of those things where I think that Robert Jordan was actually on the wrong track with how he handled that particular character and the people around that character. In comparison, I think that Sanderson was on the right track, but I think that material needed to have been come up with prior to writing A Memory of Light. But we'll talk a little bit more on that point specifically within The Ugly. You know, as some other points of like minor disappointments with A Memory of Light is like there are some aspects of the story here that don't get as resolved as I maybe would have liked to see them. Notably, I think that the ways are heavily hinted at being really important within the book, but then they just don't end up really showing up, and there's a very specific reason why that happens. Again, we'll talk about that in The Ugly. But yeah, so like there are some very minor disappointments that I have with the book. On a more like technical perspective, I think that like this is like more of a nitpick than anything. You know, it doesn't really affect the quality of the book, but I do think that the chapter delineations of A Memory of Light are super silly and honestly overall kind of stupid. Because like when there's like 3 or more POVs every single chapter, and those POVs are quite frankly rarely inherently connected to each other, and when chapter titles only really are relevant to like one POV or scene within each chapter, the way that chapters are handled in A Memory of Light just feels super silly. I mean, look no further than the fact that the last battle, chapter 37 of the book, isn't even, you know, really separate from what comes before or after it, quite frankly. You know, like the last battle could have been from the point it started all the way until like the epilogue, basically, and it would have still been basically appropriate. Those last 85 pages pre-epilogue are almost just as much that chapter as anything within the chapter is. And, you know, I've already made this point, like this entire book is the last battle, quite frankly. Like you could get away with this just being the prologue, one chapter titled The Last Battle, and then the epilogue. And like, it would not have changed anything. That is how kind of pointless the chapter delineations of A Memory of Light are. Like I said, it's a very kind of similar or a very silly thing to like point out in this section, but like it is worth noting. You know, I think that chapters have generally been like kind of served a purpose throughout the series. And like in A Gathering Storm, for example, every chapter felt like a chapter in and of itself. That started to fall apart a little bit in Towers of Midnight, but generally was still okay. But A Memory of Light, the chapters may as well not have even been there, quite frankly. Like, they just might as well not have even been there. So I'm very slightly bothered by that for very, nitpicky types of reasons. But yeah, the last point that I want to bring up for the bad is that a very particular aspect of the epilogue, the primary subject matter of the epilogue, we shall say. I know that's very vague, but this is a spoiler-free review. The primary subject matter of the epilogue of this book probably should have been explained a little bit more. This is probably my biggest it's not my biggest active gripe with the series, really. It's more of a minute thing, but it's still something that I think probably should have been explained a little bit more than it is. Like I said, I won't say what it is for spoilers, but there's some metaphysical switch that occurs within the book. If you know, you know. And the mechanics, quote unquote mechanics of how and why that all happens, not just in accordance with this book, but just kind of idealistically through a handful of books of the series, going back to even when Robert Jordan was doing some stuff. There are aspects to how and why this happens and why it, quote unquote, makes sense that just isn't explicit enough in the series, in my opinion. There are hints at some things that make you basically be able to understand, okay, I know there's something going on here that makes this make sense, even though I'm not getting it, so I will suspend my disbelief just enough to accept that this happens, even though it doesn't actually make any sense, because despite the fact that there are hints at some things, the actual mechanics of what happens there with the epilogue, with the end of the book, don't feel logically deducible. You can't actually figure out why that happens the way it does without it being explained to you. Maybe some people figured it out, but that's just not something that I think that 99% of readers of this book or this series are going to be able to understand on their own. And that is something that I think probably readers should be able to understand at least implicitly on their own without it having to be explained. So that's just kind of a very slight problem that I have with the very ending. But now we're going to go ahead and talk about the ugly here. And it is less about the ugly of A Memory of Light itself. It is more about what is actually not in this book. So there are a couple things that I talked about in the bad in that last section that I said we'd talk a little bit more about here. The bit of the war that I think isn't foreshadowed enough, that particular character that shows up, that is actually in River of Souls, a short story length sequence of scenes that was cut from the book for pacing and structure or pacing and focus reasons. And I agree with that. In the case of River of Souls, the ugly of it is that its lack of inclusion in A Memory of Light actually makes sense. The unfortunate thing is that I think that material is important enough that it should still be read. So it's it feels missing in this book or within the series, even though the reason why it's not in A Memory of Light specifically is totally justified and makes sense, because it would negatively impact this book. It's just that I think that material still needed to exist somewhere, And then there's the bit about, I think, that the ways were underutilized. That particular complaint of mine appears within another cut sequence of scenes, this time novella length, titled A Fire Within the Ways. In the case of Fire Within the Ways, the ugly of it is that it actually handles multiple things that appear in this book better, because River of Souls is canon, and like I said, was cut from the book for pacing reasons, basically. Fire Within the Ways is non-canon because it's an alternate version of some things happening, and the material that is within A Fire Within the Ways that is repurposed into the final book here is actually better within the cut content, within that non-canon version of the story, than they are in this book. But the reasons why A Fire Within the Ways was cut also make sense. It took a lot of time to get that sequence of scenes to be where it was at, which was decent, still a little bit messy. And the ugly is that I think A Fire Within the Ways should have been the way that some of those things actually happened in this book. I think it would have been better if the time had been taken to make that work. It would not have been easy, and it would have taken a lot of time to do so. But yeah, I just think that River of Souls needed to be in the series somewhere, and I think that A Fire Within the Ways was probably the better way to handle a couple of particular things within A Memory of Light, and so I was made retroactively ever so slightly more disappointed in this book because of the cut content, ironically enough. So, in terms of a recommendation of Memory of Light, I mean, like, this recommendation is kind of pointless. You know, by the time you're getting to the last book of a 14-book series, oh, do I recommend you read this book? No, you should skip the last book of the Wheel. No, I'm not going to say that because that would be incredibly silly. But if you're wondering, just generally speaking, if this last arc, if these last 3 books in general, if this book is worth reaching within the series, generally speaking, I'm going to say yes. Like, it's the short answer. I'm going to say yes, it is worth reaching. If you are like stuck in the slog and you're wondering if it's worth pushing through those last few books, or if you think that you should probably just read chapter summaries or something so that you can get to the Brandon Sanderson entries, I think that you should seriously do that. That's not to say that you should read the entire series if you hate it just to get to these books, because they're not that good. If you don't like Wheel of Time from the beginning, there's no point to continue on this far, of course. But for a more applicable recommendation when it comes to A Memory of Light, like specifically, I think if you're going to be reading this book, if you have not read this book yet, but you're, getting close to it or something, if you happen to be one of those rare viewers who is like checking out a review for a book you haven't quite got to yet within a series because you want to see the reputation of it for some reason. I know some people who do that. I'm somebody who likes to do that sometimes. If you happen to be one of those people, I implore you to read River of Souls before you read A Memory of Light. I think that you should do that. Worth noting, River of Souls is within an anthology collection edited by Sean Speakman titled Unfettered. It is Unfettered 1 that River of Souls is included in. I think that you should read that story before you get to A Memory of Light. So I seriously mean that, by the way. I think it would have been better if those scenes had been like spread throughout Towers of Midnight. But I do think that that material is effective enough and important enough within the context of this book that it is worth reading before you get to this book rather than after the fact, the way that I did it. And furthermore, as an additional like extra recommendation point here, I might ironically recommend against reading A Fire Within the Ways, the non-canon story. If you do want to read it, it is also in Unfettered, but it is in Unfettered 3, also edited by Sean Speakman, but it is the 3rd entry that contains Fire Within the Ways. I like the material of Fire Within the Ways a lot, but like I said, it kind of retroactively made certain aspects of Memory of Light disappointing, so if you don't want to be ever so slightly disappointed by a couple of the things that I was disappointed by in this book on account of non-canon cut content, you should probably avoid reading Fire Within the Ways, but you should read River of Souls beforehand. That is my opinion. But there you have it. That is the review. The final proper review for a Wheel of Time book, an individual Wheel of Time book review, we shall say. As I mentioned, did I even mention this at the start of the video? I don't know. Actually, I did, yeah, because there are going to be more videos about this series. Specifically on Thursday, I will be doing a full series recommendation and review video. It's more like a review and recommendation video where I'm going to try my best to succinctly wrap up my thoughts on the broader series in a spoiler-free format. So that's what I'm going to do on Thursday. And then a week after that, I will be doing a tier list and ranking video for the Wheel of Time, and that video specifically I actually recorded before this one, so like that video is like an hour long just to get through the tier list, and then I think I take another half hour or something to get through the ranking and comparison part, because they're slightly different and it's an interesting conversation. But yeah, those will be 2 separate videos coming in 2 days from now and then a week after that. And I do have other Wheel of Time video ideas to do in the future, but few of those are pressing. I do think I have one more video that I might do a little bit later in the year, a good bit later in the year, but otherwise wrapping up the series with the review on Thursday and then with the ranking on the Thursday after that is how I'm going to close the Wheel of Time. But today was just finishing the last individual Wheel of Time book review, which is pretty crazy, just about 3 years. So yeah, thank you for watching this video. If you did, I hope I didn't make you too angry with it, but you know, I probably did. Who am I to say? In either case, I really appreciate you for watching. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.